Hi, everyone. My name is Tatiana Batamarco, and I want to welcome you all to this resilience gardening webinar. So I am a faculty member in food studies at Bennington College, and I work in CAPA, the Center for the Advancement of Public Action, in which we have a Mellon grant that we're operating under to create educational offerings that address food insecurity in the town of Bennington and the region. And so I want to start by thanking CAPA and Mellon Foundation for their support. Also co-hosting this with the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum, which we'll hear about more in a second. So I teach food studies here and been very excited. I'm teaching a class right now for my college students on the topic of resilience. And as we had this COVID crisis descend upon us all, we sent all of our students home and started teaching online, this topic of resilience became especially real to everyone. Resilience is at its most simple, the ability for a community or an individual to bounce back from setbacks, from crises. And I really think that gardening and food systems are one of the ways that we can bounce back from this pandemic situation and the resulting food insecurity that has become so exacerbated due to loss of jobs, livelihood, and the lack of safety in being able to leave the house. So one thing I want to briefly share with you all, and I'm going to put a link in the chat box, is that as part of our initiative to address food insecurity, we are launching a Grow a Row campaign, which is an open call to all local gardeners to grow an extra row of food and to donate that food to food insecure folks in our town. And we're making that really easy and accessible to everyone by we're going to start a Tuesday drop-off at the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum. So if you have any extra vegetables at any point during the summer from your garden that you grew yourself, you can drop them off on Tuesdays at the Robert Frost House, and then we're going to bring them to local food pantries. We've been in communication with his pantry in particular, which is a food pantry in Bennington that hasn't had much fresh food available. So they're really excited about this collaboration. And yeah, so click on the link if you're interested in volunteering or signing up, and I can also ask questions about that. But today we're being joined by three gardeners, three folks who've spent many years growing food and know a lot about how to care for the soil and grow food and medicine. So Shannon Barsotti is the Community Development Director of the Town of Bennington. She's also the co-owner of Longview Farm in Pownal, where she raises lamb and chickens and has had a huge vegetable garden for many years. Aila West is a medicinal herb farmer who grows and wildcrafts Ayurvedic, Chinese, and Western herbs. And Dane Whitman is the owner of Gray Oak Landscaping and Garden Design, which is based in Bennington, and promotes edible and ecological land management. So all three of them are going to briefly say a little bit about what they do and their take on resilience gardening, and then we're going to open it up for all of you to ask your questions and to dialogue with you about this exciting proliferation of homegrown food that we're seeing as a response to the current pandemic that we hope will continue long beyond this crisis. But first, before I turn it over to our panel, I want to turn it over to Erin McKenney, who is the director of the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum.
Great. Thanks so much, Tatiana. As Tatiana said, I'm Erin McKenney. I'm the director of the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum at Bennington College. So wonderful to see all of you here today. First, I want to thank Aila, Dane, and Shannon for participating, for telling us their stories and helping us as we create. Ooh. Sorry, I'm viewing someone's screen. There we go, sorry. as we create and maintain our own gardens. And also thanks so much to Tatiana for her work pulling this webinar together and for being our moderator. Robert Frost lived on several farms throughout his life. He got his start with chickens at a young age and lived for 10 years on a farm in Derry, New Hampshire, with his young and growing family. There, he was primarily farming. His writing happened after daylight hours. He'd stay up late into the night writing at his kitchen table. He moved to the stone house in Vermont years later, also farming here with his son Carol. Farming was subject matter for Frost, but also, I think, essential for his health and well-being, and for his writing. He would shift between farming, teaching, and writing throughout his life, each interest feeding the others. Frost was able to create a different type of space for himself with farming, and Robert Penn Warren said that poems could take root in those spaces. I'm going to read a poem that was likely written in Derry during some of his farming years, but published years later in the collection Mountain Interval. Putting in the seed. You come to fetch me from my work tonight when supper's on the table, and we'll see if I can leave off bearing the white, soft petals fallen from the apple tree. Soft petals, yes, but not so barren quite, mingled with these smooth bean and wrinkled pea, and go along with you ere you lose sight of what you come for and become like me, slave to a springtime passion for the earth. How love burns through the putting in the seed, on through the watching for that early birth, when, just as the soil tarnishes with weed, the sturdy seedling with arched body comes, shouldering its way and shedding the earth crumbs. So now I'll hand it over to Shannon. Thanks, Shannon.
Well, before Shannon jumps in, I just wanted to quickly, one thing I neglected to mention was that as we're going through, like I said, our three panelists will speak briefly. If you have a burning question and you don't want to lose it, type it into the chat box and we'll be sure to try and revisit that. So feel free to type in the chat box at any time. Also, when we move into the Q&A, there is a hand raising function, which I would like everyone to use. And you can do that by clicking on the participants tab at the bottom and hovering over your own name. And that should allow you to raise your hand. If you need help with that, you can ask questions in the chat box as well. But if you raise your hand and then I can unmute and call on people, I think that'll make things move smoothly. So without further ado, let me mute myself and turn it over to Shannon. And Shannon, I will share your PowerPoints as well. So just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Great. Hi, everyone. So it's so exciting to see so many people participating, and I recognize some faces. I see my neighbor, Ray. Well, I'm really excited to be part of this because some of you know me as the Bennington Community Development Director, but I also have a whole another life as a very avid gardener and small farmer. And the name of our farm here in Pownal is Longview Farm. Now, Tatiana, can everybody see that screen? Should I move anything, or you've got that under control? My whole life experience has really revolved around gardening. Some of my earliest memories, I grew up in Oklahoma, are spending time with my great-grandfather. He had a tiny house surrounded by his enormous garden. So, it's something that's been a part of my childhood. I went through the teenage years of probably rebelling against it, but then as soon as I was in college at the University of Kansas, I joined a community garden. And then I've been doing it ever since, whether I was in a city or now with lots of space here in Pownal. So this is our farm, Longview Farm, and we raise sheep. We also have chickens, we've raised turkeys, and all of them are part of the farm ecosystem. Do you want to go to the next one? And it really all starts with the soil. So I started thinking about this concept of resilience gardening and kind of came up with a list in my mind of some of the main themes when I think about resilience. So starting with the soil, really understanding the soil that you're working with. And, you know, one of the first things to do is to test your soil. And you can do that with the extension service has testing kits available. And that's one of the first things we did. And we were lucky enough to find out that we had the right pH for our soil here in Pownal, although we had so many rocks that, especially coming from the Midwest, when I first started a garden here, I couldn't believe it. I thought, was there a foundation here? I just couldn't figure it out. But that's part of living in Vermont. So our soil over the years, we just keep amending, and it's gotten better and better the more care that we give it. If you want to go to the next slide. So here's a photo of some of our animals. I think I'm holding a grain bucket right outside of this photo, and that's why everyone's heading in my direction. So having animals really has been a huge part of the learning process, you know, and all that they provide. Sheep in particular, you know, are just so amazing because we're raising them for our source of protein. We raise lamb, and we also use their wool, and then, you know, their manure, it fertilizes all the pasture as well as our garden. And now we have horses, so that's a great thing. You want to go to the next photo? So here's a photo of all of that compost, which is a lot of work in the wintertime to clean out the barn, but we're happy to have it at the end of the season. And, you know, this is obviously on a huge scale, but I've done even on a really tiny scale composting with kids and worms in a box, you know, doing worm composting that you can do under your kitchen sink. So, I mean, starting with compost is a great way to learn about gardening as well. And also getting to know your farmers and getting a source of animal manure that you can mix into your garden is something that's a great thing to do. Okay, next slide. And then here are chickens that we raise. These are our hens that we're raising for eggs. And they have access to that big pile of compost. So they do the job of scratching it up and making it, you know, more usable over time. That first photo where I was holding a pile of dirt in my hand was that same, you know, sheep and horse manure just a couple years later that turns into soil. Do you want to go to the next slide? So my first step in the spring, this gives you shows you kind of the scale. I mean, I do have a large area that I'm working with, but we work the compost into the beds, and this is a photo of planting potatoes. So potatoes, as soon as they sprout, you know, I hill up over the potato, and then as soon as they sprout, I cover those with dirt as well. I mean, with straw. And then the other beds that I have here have black fabric, and that's where I plant the rest of the vegetables. So number 2 on my list of resilient gardening is to mimic nature. And if you really think about where the best, most black soil is, it's in the forest, on the forest floor. And the forest floor is always covered, right, with debris. So even though we have this image in our mind of these perfectly plowed, you know, landscapes, right? Really what we want to be aiming for is keeping the soil covered at all times, because that is bringing nutrients back into the soil. And I've learned that in part through lazy gardening, because over time, at times I've just left things on the ground and thrown all of the debris on top of the bed, or just left the covering over the bed. And I've found that actually the soil benefits from that. And so I've really started to move to a no-till form of gardening as much as possible, because I think that everything does better. You can go to the next one. And this is a photo of, I have a nice sunny spot when you come into our house with these benches. And so I've started just putting my trays of seeds right there and covering them with plastic to keep the soil moist. You can also use a dishcloth or paper towels, but the key is really to keep the soil moist. And sometimes that can be a challenge if you're not home. So I think it's easy to keep them covered. If you want to go to the next slide. And this is when I start seeds in the beds themselves. I try to cover them with either straw, or I'll use burlap. These are the row covers, the white material, and that just helps with the germination as well as keeping the ground moist. If you want to go to the next one. And I can start looking. It looks like some questions are coming up in chat, and I'll answer those. So all of that sort of bare spring look becomes this lush garden in the summertime. So this is kind of at the peak of summer when everything fills out. You can go to the next slide. And if you're going to get into gardening, you have to commit to cooking because you're going to get a lot of food. So sometimes at the end of August, I feel somewhat a slave to all of the fruits and veggies that I'm growing, but it's very rewarding. And, learning about food preservation, there's just so much to learn. So it's fun to experiment with fermenting and freezing and canning. If you want to go to the next slide. And I also really love all of the winter squash. Those are one of my favorite things to grow because of how long they store and all the different things you can do with them. Next slide. Here's the plums that were abundant last year. And next slide. And here's some fermenting that I did. This is a fermented salsa. And then this is a plum jam. Next slide. And this is our farm website. We've started to host events like weddings, and we've had school groups up here. We've done some really interesting pasture workshops and farm tours. So those are all my slides. I can answer some of if any individual questions came. Let me see what I've got here. It looks like, has Shannon added to the soil over the years to keep up a healthy pH? Our pH when we first tested our soil was already within the range. Like the ideal pH is about 6.5. So I know certain things like asparagus like a more alkaline pH, and so I've learned about things that you can add. Lime you can add to your soil. Wood ash adds more lime as well naturally, and then things that like more acidic, you can add pine needles and wood chips, add more acid to the soil. Let's see. So I don't think any of these questions are specifically for me, but I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can move on to another presenter.
Okay, guess I'll jump in and we'll get back to the questions in a little bit. So my name is Aila. I work at Bennington College in Kappa. I also am a part-time herb grower, and I started studying herbs about 10 years ago. It's really hard to call myself an herbalist. I'm not sure at what stage in the process I will feel confident enough to use that term, but for now I grow herbs. So about 4 years ago, I started growing for a company. They're named Woodland Essence, and they're based out of Utica, New York. And they're a great little company. You can find them online. And so I sell wholesale to them. These are some of the herbs that I have sold to them. And it's been a really incredible experience growing herbs. And I think that it's a really important part. Herbalism in some ways is a really important part of the idea of resilient gardening. And it's a huge topic, and we won't get into all the details today. But I'm happy to answer any questions people have about herbs and specific herbs. They're welcome to reach out to me after this as they'd like. So I'll just focus mostly on the growing side, but just kind of talk about the idea of medicine, of herbs as medicine. This is something that humans have been doing forever, and it's getting a little bit of resurgence. I think it's had its waves, and I think now it is something that people are turning to, partly because of our healthcare system, partly because of just access and just all the pieces that make herbs something that people can take charge of themselves, pay attention to their health, and be able to just be more attentive, feel more empowered to do something about some things. This is not to say don't go to the doctor. This is just to say this is a great compliment to what you can do on your own, the more you learn. So this is my plug for people to learn more about herbalism. So when I started growing herbs, I didn't have much experience gardening before, just like a little bit. And there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of talking to people. And those are things that I recommend people do as they jump into gardening in all ways, or farming. One thing that I discovered though was that plants want to grow. That's what they're there for. And I think that we can do a lot of manipulating of the world around them in order to make them grow better or grow more. But in general, I think that it's important to think about herbs as something, or plants in general, as something that are there to, like, this is nature, this is natural. And it's great to pay attention to them and to know what they need, but at the same time to also recognize that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that being said, I do have quite a few systems in place to make them grow better. Tatiana, if you want to go to the next slide, I can show you the farm. So this is where I live. These are the herb gardens. Well, most of them. Some are off the picture. And as you can see, similar to Shannon, I do use some weed barriers. Well, actually, this picture was taken yesterday. The weed barriers aren't down yet. But you can see the drip lines for water lines that we just put down, and eventually we'll putting some weed barriers down. I started using a paper weed barrier on the right. The picture on the right has you can see that the purple that's a paper weed barrier, which it falls apart over the season, so it's just one season. But in some ways, I like it better because I use the plastic weed barrier for edging the garden. It's really hard to keep weeds out of the garden once you've contained them from the inside, but that helps. And then putting some paper down in the inside. So the thing that I've discovered about gardening, especially as it's grown over the years, is that it's a difference. You kind of have to always balance time and money that you put into it, and in some ways those can be seen on equal footing, because depending on if this is a full-time job for you or if it's just like a hobby or something you're doing on your own, you have to decide how much time you want to commit. And if you don't want to commit time, you can put a little bit more money into it. So for example, I don't have the time to weed, so that's why I use weed barrier, and it's amazingly effective, and it doesn't seem to harm the soil or anything like that. With the soil, I also do no-till, and my technique for building these beds and for maintaining them is basically just to take this big field, buy many yards of compost from some local compost providers, put down a few inches of that, and then put the weed barrier on top of that and plant plants directly into them. So I seed everything for the most part indoors. I start in the end of March, early April, and they stay in a very sunny room in my house until they get big enough to pot up, and then they go out into the greenhouse that you can see in this picture. It's pretty small, so it's not for when they get super big, but this is a way for them to be out there in April to stay warm. It's not a heated greenhouse. And then around this time of year, this next week or so, they're all going to go out into the garden. And then they just grow, and they don't require a lot once they're out there. All that being said, this is the very intentional herb garden that can be created, and it certainly does not to be to this scale in order to be able to provide for yourself or for your family and friends in your community. Just knowing that everything, if you can look outside and see plants, there's a very good chance that they have medicinal properties to them. And there's just so much that's available to us, even if we don't have a very controlled garden like that. You know, if you have a plot of land that is completely overgrown with weeds, most likely it has some things in there that are going to be super beneficial for you, like stinging nettle or dandelion root. You can see all the dandelion that's out there in that picture right now, and or burdock. These are all really powerful medicinal medicines that that can be used. So the idea of being able to look outside and work with the nature that's around you, and to be able to provide some support for yourself and support for your body, and it's a pretty empowering thing to be able to do. And if anybody, so there are some herbs I would recommend that for anybody who lives in this area and is interested in just starting with a couple of basic herbs that are useful and easy to use. I do have a few recommendations. I have many recommendations, but a few I'll point out here that I've had a lot of success with. One is Tulsi. It's also called holy basil. It's an adaptogen, and it's an Ayurvedic. It's from India, but it does grow very well out here, and it is really wonderful, delicious in tea. It's calming. It's very nice for the nervous system, for balancing energies. So that's one that I would recommend trying to grow here. I buy most of my seeds to start with. If I'm starting a new type of plant, I buy a lot of them from Strictly Medicinal Seeds. They're based out of Oregon, and they're a pretty wonderful company, and everything is open pollinated, which means you can save the seeds. So then I do save seeds. So then most of my plants now are coming from saved seeds of my own. So Tulsi is a great one. Some other things that are a little bit more native to this area, echinacea, also coneflower, is something that's really great medicine to have. I think most people have heard of it if they know anything. I've heard about herbal medicine and all. And that's a really easy one, and it's beautiful to have in the garden. Chamomile grows well. Lemon balm grows too well sometimes. It takes over, so be careful where you plant that. And there's a ton others that are just great things just to add into a garden that you might have with vegetables or anything, or flowers, because they provide that little extra something that is really, really lovely to have. So, and all these things I mentioned, there's lots of properties, medicinal properties that we could talk about another time, why they're wonderful. But I also have some book recommendations if anybody wants to look into that on their own and to see what else is going on. All right, now the screen has stopped sharing. We'll move on to the next.
Okay, thanks Aila, thanks Shannon, Aaron, and Tatiana. Glad to be a part of this, and thanks everybody for coming out. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy, and glad that you're here, since I've been reflecting that sort of one of the most risky things that I do is take a trip to the grocery store these days. So the more that you can minimize something like that, it's better. So like I said, my name's Dane. I run a tiny LLC called Gray Oak Landscaping and Garden Design. Started the business about a year ago, but I've been gardening forever. And I actually graduated from Bennington College, took classes in Kappa, did my work in pretty much food resilience, food sovereignty, land management. I've been working with farms forever, and I got my permaculture design certificate at Whole Systems Design in Rochester, Vermont, which is an awesome permaculture site if you want to check it out. I just want to say, I don't have a slideshow myself, just going to be speaking. And I wanted to just briefly point to the fact that right now, the fact that we're in the middle of a crisis, it's pointing to the value of resilience gardening, and thinking about the climate crisis that we're also dealing with right now, and the instability of our national food system is something I want to point to. So if people are starting up community gardens right now, if people are looking to establish new things, I really just want to put something out there to continue this work beyond the COVID-19 time, because building that resilience within our communities will be great. To briefly point a little bit to what I see as the sort of instability of our food system and a little bit of my story. I grew up in Southern California, which is one of the biggest food producers in the world. But meanwhile, it's pretty much mined its natural fertility down to all but depleted. Drilling for water deeper and deeper to the point that aquifers are hollowed out and land is actually subsiding where the water has been drilled out. And just looking at the use of pesticides, fungicides on monocultures to produce things like strawberries, berries, which for us that might be enjoying year-round fruits and vegetables in our grocery stores, this is kind of what we're working with. Meanwhile, it's one of the most populated states. It is the most populated state in the country, and prone to natural disasters like drought, fires, things that are being exacerbated by climate change, not to mention earthquakes and things like that. So when we think about resilience in gardening, I think it's interesting that it's coming up to the fore right now, because this is what I've been thinking about for the last 8 years. And I think that it's sort of something that maybe hopefully people will pick up on a little bit more. So as far as the work that I'm doing right now is thinking about what can we produce here sustainably. Most of my work as far as a landscape designer is looking at tree crops. Berries are kind of my specialty. I look to do edible, ecological landscape design wherever I can. And really looking at replacing lawns with gardens to whatever extent we can, and looking at making it both functional, ecologically functional, and beautiful as well, because I think it's really important for us to be able to make these spaces for us. I also agree with what Shannon is saying as far as finding resourceful ways to kind of use what's already there produced by nature, be resourceful in how we build our soil. The idea of pulling weeds and leaving them on top of a bed that you might not have time to plant this year round can be a lot more effective than I might have imagined. When you pull those weeds apart, you might see that it's teeming with life underneath. So if you have poor soil, it's sort of beginning that ecological process of decomposition. I also want to say, just looking at composting is an idea that a lot of people have as far as you set aside a compost pile. But I would say think about making the garden itself a compost bed in a way. Look at mulching your paths. Look at having crops interspersed that you'll be able to cut and leave as a mulch. Things like comfrey. If you're pulling up dandelion roots, just leave them right there. There's a giant burdock plant that I would just sort of strip off the leaves and throw them down, and just know that that root is eventually going to decay into this big thing of organic matter. So having some patience as you build the soil is something I would really recommend. Otherwise, I'll just try to get to answering some of these questions that I've seen pop up before. Looking at starting a victory garden, like I said, if you're going to start something now, either for seniors in your community or something like that, just the work is there, and looking to find ways to keep it sustainable. Finding leaders in your community, creating programs that can kind of go beyond this. Somebody asked about including children in this work, and I once did a fieldwork term working with public elementary schools. It was called Food for Thought. And what I would really go for is go ahead and, look, we have another screen share. But I would really recommend, look, it's like me and then me. I would really recommend treat the garden as a classroom. I really think that the garden is a classroom. There's so many different things that you can pull from. So just like you would with a normal classroom setting, look to teachers in your community, science teachers, a lot of opportunity for biology, soil science, things like that. answering questions for, yeah, I do want to go back to the weed barrier concept. Like I said, I do a lot of perennial planting, so I'll plant trees, things like that. And the idea of weeding is something that I've done a lot of in my time, and I'm thinking, what is a better way? And I can't tell you how many gardens I work on where I go down to dig a hole and I hit weed fabric with 2 inches of decomposed leaves on top of it, and then you try to pull it up and you're killing plants as you go, and it rips apart as you go. And so I believe that yes, plastic fabric is kind of a crime. So I really go for paper and cardboard. Start collecting it if you aren't already. It is just an awesome thing to be able to pat down right on top of weeds, throw a little bit of mulch straw on top of, put it around plants that you already have. Big proponent for that. I'm looking at other questions just because local.
Shannon also had her hand up. I think she wanted
Yeah,
to.
yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dane. I just was gonna respond to a couple of things that you said. I agree with the on the comment you just made about the paper. One of the easiest things to use, and I think I mentioned it here, but you know, if you go to Home Depot or any building supply place, and the long contractor rolls of paper that you put down when you're painting, just roll it right out and then poke holes in it. Because yes, as Dane was saying, one of my favorite stories is my dad has a big garden, and he said that he, when he was working on a garden, came across like ancient carpet. So I mean, plants will grow through anything. So you know, if you can decompose whatever you're working with, that's a great idea too. But I also wanted to mention, you know, resources. You know, at my work I had as the community development director, you know, gardening is just such a great way to build community. And a couple of people have mentioned ideas of school gardens or senior gardens. And, you know, I would definitely be glad to talk with you more about that here in our community. And I've also done it in other towns and cities. But there are some good resources too, as far as grants to get small gardens started. And I can talk to you more about that. Just to go over a couple of other thoughts too, when I was thinking about resiliency, this idea of mimicking nature and increasing diversity. A couple of people have asked the question about rotating crops. And that's something that I've found is really important to do, even if you have a large area, just to bring down problems with pests and disease. If you really keep the crops moving, so keep a little journal for yourself so that you see what you planted and where you know, make sure you move it the next year. Also, you know, if you're working with poor soil, one of the best things you can do is container gardening, and that can be small pots, but it can also be raised beds. And some of the questions have had to do with, you know, what do we do if the soil is so poor? And I was part of a group in Chicago of urban gardeners, and so we were facing that, you know, in the city. And what we did was just start new, you know. So we put down a barrier and then put the containers right over them and started with raised beds. And then in the interim, you can be working on improving the other soil. But that's an easy way to get started quickly. So increasing diversity, extending the season. I mean, we have to be resilient when, you know, what was it, like a week ago that we got 6 inches of snow here in Vermont. So learning about ways to cover, you know, your plants and keep them safe from the cold. And then I think getting to know other growers and getting to know your farmers, because one thing that I found is, you know, I do try to start a lot from seed, but you know, the people that have the greenhouses really know how to do this. And because we have such a short season, getting involved with local farmers and supporting them, learning from them, and you know, getting some starts from them or getting your compost, etc., is always a really good idea. And one of my favorite things about living in Pownal is that we have such a large group of people who are growing or farming that it really builds community, and there's a lot of bartering that happens. So, I'll get my veggie starts from Wildstone Farm from John and Joy, and trade lamb, or I've traded eggs for honey, or and so it's just, that's a great part about being part of a collective of growers as well.
I see that we've got one hand raised, so I just want to, Tessa, if you're ready, I'll just unmute you.
Yes, hi. I have been gardening for a bit, and weed control is definitely one of my challenges. What I've been trying to do instead is use plants, whether that's like Swiss chard or herbs or something like that, as weed guard, because I feel like it's a space in my garden that I really want to utilize. And I just wondered if any of the more seasoned gardeners had any suggestions for herbs or plants to use as weed guard.
Dane, you want to take it? Go.
Ayla, go ahead.
Well, I don't have a ton of experience using. Well, okay, I tried to use clover once as like a low crop. The problem is that the groundhogs love it, so you have to think about the extra plants that you're putting in there. Who is it going to attract? What kind of damage could that do? So that's what my experience is. I think it is possible, but just be making that extra connection about like what else is it introducing into your environment.
I would suggest for a couple of plants. They're not. It's purely aesthetic, but hostas seem to be a plant that will just completely take over and not take up any space. I don't know if you like hostas. Another thing I've seen is lemongrass. Seems to kind of form these little clumps, or lemon balm, I think, will kind of form these little mats, and that's not something you need to weed a lot of. There are things like mint, which becomes a legitimate weed once you introduce it. So it's sort of a trade-off. And I'm trying to, and yeah, things like the nettle, spreading nettle, yarrow is another decent one that sort of becomes a ground cover, and creeping thyme, oregano. I'll stop there.
I was also going to say creeping thyme. Anything that creeps like that is great for the ground, but also lettuces. They grow fast. Any kind of greens, like fast growing greens like arugula, etc., because they tend to like shade. And so if you're growing, like when I grow something like sugar snap peas grow up, and I'll just plant all the lettuces all around them because they don't mind being a little bit more shady. Or you have the classic, the Three Sisters garden, which is corn, beans, and squash. So you grow the corn, it grows up, the beans grow up the corn, and then the squash grow all around the cover. Squash too. Any kind of squash plant is gonna take over the ground.
Or cucumbers.
Go ahead, Dane.
Yeah, there's another question I've seen pop up, and this is sort of the second one, talking about working on a slope. And I would go ahead and just recommend, there was two different questions. For the first one, as far as having a raised bed on a sloped yard, or building a terrace, try to start constructing from the bottom. Do not try to construct a terrace from the top down, because it's kind of like trying to build a roof over a house before you have the rest of the foundation. So gravity will apply. So that's a better way to go. There's another question. I don't know if they're on right now. It was submitted earlier. As far as if you are weeding a slope, or removing weeds or eradicating weeds from a slope, you'll start to get erosion. So if you're removing something like garlic mustard, I would just make sure to spread another seed down as a start, maybe a meadow mix or something like that, and then straw, hay, anything like that over the top.
I just wanted to respond to that idea of terracing. I think it was Lindsay who asked about that in a sloped yard. And I just saw a really cool idea that I've actually heard from a couple of people that they've done this, which is a permaculture method called, I think it's called Hugel culture. It's German, and where you basically plant. Might be a way to, you kind of could do both by terracing with older logs that are decomposing, and then you create a bed right in that. With mulch, etc. And it could be a way to also work on a slope.
I'll just read a question aloud. So this is from Barbara. It says, our lot in New Hampshire is so shady, except in one small area with maybe 4 hours of sun. Soil, clay, and sand and coal. Our front yard has more sun, but can you do veggies in very small places on a main street with lots of traffic? I've started doing arrow gardens indoors. We've had a good lettuce crop. With heirloom tomatoes, they're coming up out of the arrow garden pods with more than one stalk. How many should I prune off? Got first flowers on tomatoes this week.
I would say, as far as having small amounts of space to work with, absolutely. I would say working along a roadside, depending on the amount of maybe salt or plow truck damage that you might anticipate. With that caveat, absolutely. I would say growing on kind of the strips. I think they've been called the hell strip, that you have in between the sidewalk and the curb, is something that a lot of urban gardeners have been working with. And what was the last part of that question about pruning?
I think it was about pruning, pulling the flowers off of heirloom tomatoes. That how much should you prune them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm trying to think back in my pruning knowledge. I'll answer one other question that was about onion and potato storage, and then that might take me back to the farm, and I'll remember about pruning tomatoes. With onion storage, a lot of people would recommend, once they develop, pull them when you're expecting a couple sunny days and let them sun cure for a couple days, then bring them in side, kind of outdoor shelter, keep up ventilation with a fan, clip them, store them, and then keep them bagged in a cool space once they are stored. And then same thing with potatoes, keep dirt on them. That helps them preserve, bag them, keep them in a cool, ventilated, dark space. And then, yeah, as far as pruning tomato blossoms, I would say really just start with anything that isn't looking healthy. And then going from there, I think it depends on the variety that you're working with.
I'll start to answer this last question that just came through. Maybe one of you can pick it up from there. I think that the size pot that you choose really depends on the size plant that you have. I'm not sure why this is, but plants like to be in the right size pot, which means that they don't necessarily like to go into a pot that's too big for them. So it's not always a good idea to just scale up. So I think just think about, whatever container it's in, use that as like, okay, it's grown out of that container. What's the next size up? And just kind of keep going from there. Unfortunately, it does mean sometimes you have to pot up a few times in order to get it to the right place, but they do much better when they are potted up into the right size that fits them.
And I just want to say that we're going to take about 5 more minutes to answer questions. So do raise your hand, and if so, I'll try to call on you. But otherwise, if our panelists just want to kind of mine questions out of the chat box, we've gotten so many good questions over the last hour.
I just saw a question about attracting pollinators and what kinds of flowers. So I've seen a lot of great, if you think about anything that's flowering is gonna attract the pollinators. So even just the really simple things that you can grow from seed, like zinnias, are great. As far as plants that also deter pests, so marigolds is a really good one. Nasturtiums are a really nice thing to put in your garden because you can eat the flower. And then those are supposed to be good for squash bugs. And they're also one that kind of spread over the ground, which is nice. I've noticed a lot of pollinators come to herbs as well. So dill is a great one to attract beneficial insects that I've seen. You guys might have other ones.
Carpet of snow alyssum, or just alyssum in general, is one that's supposed to help with stuff like tobacco hornworms and stuff that shows up on tomatoes, and last year showed up on my ashwagandha, which was a surprise. So that's another one. And yeah, any of the herbs are generally good, flowering herbs. Tulsi is a great. So Tulsi, another plug for Tulsi as a companion plant for your gardens, that would be great too.
And I just want to, I'm going to call on Molly and then Autumn. I see your hands up, and then we'll probably be about out of time then. So Molly, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I'm a novice gardener, so this is maybe a super obvious question, and I apologize if it is. I was wondering how seasons affect your plant growing if you're growing inside or in a greenhouse. Because of lighting levels, do you still need to stick with the usual seasons, or is there more flexibility?
I'll venture to answer that. Definitely, a lot of what indoor is seen as is season extension in a way, right? So it won't necessarily be the best. I can't imagine myself like starting a lettuce plant in the middle of the winter. You can do it completely with grow lights if you wanted to, but just because the light levels as you get out of seasons are decreasing just due to the perspective of the sun, I would just assume that plants will feel like that's a little bit wonky. So normally the idea would be to get an early start or maybe extend a little bit later. You will have a little bit more flexibility by working inside, especially if you're able to control the light levels.
Yeah, I agree. And just to tag on to that about winter, sometimes for things that you're overwintering inside, like in a heated area, it's kind of just like a holding on period, like get the plants through the winter. They're not going to generally thrive during that time, but if you can just get them back until that, March or so, then they're going to start to pick right up again.
A lot of our local growers, if you've seen, they're amazing at extending the season and keeping things going all through the winter. But a lot of that is planting so much in the fall. So for example, I know Mighty Food Farm will plant, tons and tons of kale in late summer. And that kale plant will just have to produce enough, or spinach, that they're picking it all winter, right? So it's not really creating new growth, but it's just maintaining it from earlier in the season.
Great. And then Autumn, would you like to ask our last question?
Sure. Hi, thanks everybody. This has been really informative. So I'm in Queens, I'm in New York City, and I'm really lucky in my backyard. I actually have a backyard that I can grow in. I like what someone said about finding a lot of rocks. I find a lot of broken bottles and clothing hangers and all kinds of weird city stuff in my soil. I'm wondering if anybody had any advice for how to create resilient gardening for the animals around. In a lot of gardening talks, I hear a lot about how to keep animals out, but how do I invite animals in, especially in a city where I want to be building habitat fragments? So, thinking about bee gardening, thinking about, I don't want to ward away squirrels, but there's a way I can divert them to eat something in my garden that I want them to eat and not the stuff I don't, things like that. So if anyone has advice for not how to turn away animals, but how to like help them enjoy and let me also enjoy my garden too.
Thank you, Autumn. That's a great question. And it brings me to something that we haven't talked about very much, which is perennials. And I would say that with a lot of, there's a lot of different berry producing plants. I think of elderberry is a somewhat compact plant that you could probably even grow in a container in your backyard. Serviceberry is one that birds absolutely love. And if you're lucky, you might actually get to eat some of it yourself if the birds don't get to it first. Blueberries is another one that you can do in your backyard. Yeah, and then as far as sunflowers, very popular with chipmunks, squirrels, birds. Just let those grow up and let them go to seed, and you'll see a lot of life take hold.
I was also going to suggest elderberries. We live in a really windy spot up here in Pownal. And I was looking for a pretty fast growing hedge that I could create, and elderberries have been wonderful. I mean, they grow fast, they have beautiful flowers, the birds absolutely love them, and then the berries themselves are medicinal. So you can make like tinctures and stuff out of the elderberries. So they're a great plant.
I just want to, add one other plant that can actually grow in full shade for everybody. Red and black currants are a berry with a kind of tart aromatic taste, but I love them. One of the few things that will produce in full shade and pretty easy to grow.
Thanks so much. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank our panelists, Aila, Dane, and Shannon. We are going to be, everyone who registered for this, we have your email, so we'll send you an email with just a recording of this, a link to that, and a list of book recommendations from our panelists, as well as some website recommendations, and also some recommendations of more free webinars that are being offered from other sources, so that you can continue your gardening journey. If you have any specific questions, you can always email about CAPA in particular. You can email kappa@bennington.edu, or you can look me up, Tatiana Batamarco, on the Bennington website. And thanks again to Erin and the Robert Frost House for co-hosting as well. And I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful day.